Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on our webinar on April 1st, 2018 and beyond, equal pay and scheduling. I am Monina Fabria, the Decent Work Project Lead for ONN. If you're new to ONN, we are the provincial network for Ontario's 55,000 nonprofits and charities, and we work to help strengthen the nonprofit sector by engaging and advocating with and for nonprofits and charities in communities across the province. But first, the technical stuff. Our webinar should last an hour. If you experience any technical difficulties during that time, we recommend closing your web browser and reopening it. If you miss anything, just know that we will email all registrants following the webinar, which will include the relevant information, webinar recording, and the slides. The slide handout is also available on the side of your screen called Handouts, and you are able to access and download it at any time. We have many people on the call joining us today, so because of that, we're going to mute participant lines to reduce noise disruptions and close the questions and chat function for this webinar. As part of our work on Bill 148, a frequently asked questions page has been developed, and details about where to find our FAQ, how to access the slide decks, and other details will be available at the end of the presentation. Lastly, thank you to the United Way of Toronto and York Region for supporting ONN in our Bill 148 education webinar series. Like I mentioned earlier, the Ontario nonprofit landscape is represented by approximately 55,000 nonprofits with a workforce of over 1 million workers. And as such, changing workplace legislation like Bill 148 obviously has a significant impact on our sector. At ONN, our mission is a strong and resilient nonprofit sector, thriving communities, and a dynamic province. Our vision is to engage, advocate, and lead with and for nonprofit and charitable organizations that work for the public benefit in Ontario. And we hope opportunities like today's webinar, which is impacting many of you, will help build and strengthen the Ontario nonprofit sector. Here's an overview of our jam-packed hour and what we will be covering. We'll have a brief overview of the last webinar, an equal pay for equal work of equal value, introduction to the scheduling changes that come to effect in January 2019, and a few notes about the enforcement of the updated ESA and employer best practices. Now, this is just a reminder that this is in no way an exhaustive or complete list of the changes to the Employment Standards Act, or the ESA, or the implications of the new equal pay for work of equal value provisions, or the scheduling provisions under the ESA, or any other law in Ontario. This presentation is legal information relevant to Ontario, and it is not to be used as legal advice. This presentation is directed at employers of non-unionized employees. Employers with unionized employees should seek legal advice if they have any questions about the compliance of their collective agreements. The content in this presentation is accurate as of today, March 29th, 2018. If you are reading or watching this post March 29th, this may not be legally accurate or updated. There are links to resources throughout this presentation that are believed to be legally accurate, but we do not guarantee that the information is accurate, timely, or complete after this date. Should you have any other questions about your rights or obligations under the Employment Standards Act or any other law, we recommend that you seek legal advice. So now I'd like to pass it off to my co-host, Natasha Prasad, to get us underway. Natasha Prasad is a partner at Formative Law, LLP, where she practices employment and human rights law. She is also an adjunct faculty member at Osgoode Hall Law School, as well as a discrimination and harassment counsel with the Law Society of Ontario. In addition to all that work, Natasha also provides advice and assistance to web content at the Community Legal Education Ontario, or CLEO. If you remember, Natasha joined us in our last webinar, so we brought her back today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to the ONN for having me once again. So in terms of, the overview, as we know, Bill 148 was first introduced on June 1st, 2017, in response to recommendations made in the final report of the Changing Workplaces Review. And the goal of this legislation was to address changes to contemporary workplaces imposed by globalization, technology, and the rise of temporary work. So in terms of the timeline summary, and this is what we covered not only in the last webinar, but in the one previous to that, in terms of what is currently in effect, we discussed the independent contractor misclassification, parental and pregnancy leaves. Of course, the big one was the increased minimum wage, the vacation changes, domestic and sexual violence leave, public holiday pay, and the personal emergency leave and overtime provisions. So these are just the timelines with respect to what's in effect now. And in terms of the new equal pay for work of equal value rules, those are coming into effect very soon on April 1st. And what we're also going to be discussing today are the new scheduling rules, which will be coming into effect on January 1st of 2019. So in terms of recapping what we discussed in the last webinar with respect to the equal pay for work of equal value, what we wanted to highlight is that, again, as I've noted earlier, coming up very quickly, these new rules with respect to equal pay for work of equal value will be in effect as of April 1st of 2018. And so as we discussed last time, while the ESA has previously addressed equal pay for equal work based on gender, meaning that men and women who perform substantially the same work are entitled to receive the same rates of pay, now there's a new consideration, which is the employment or work status. And that means either referring to a difference in the number of hours regularly worked or a difference in the term of employment, including permanent, temporary, casual, or seasonal status. So what that means is employees who are casual, part-time, temporary, or seasonal must receive equal pay for substantially the same work performed by full-time or permanent employees. And this also applies to temporary help agency employees, also known as assignment employees, who are likewise substantially doing the same work as employees. They must also be paid the same rate of pay. Okay, so in terms of how this is now going to be implemented. So if an employee is paid less than another employee because of a difference in their employment status, where the employees A, perform substantially the same work, B, at the same establishment, and their performance requires substantially the same skill, effort, and responsibility, and the employees work under similar working conditions, then the employer, in this case, has likely violated the equal pay for work of equal value provisions. And I just wanted to highlight that all of these factors have to be present in order for a violation to be found. And another quick reminder is, let's not forget that the equal pay for equal work provisions do not apply to full-time employees who perform substantially the same work and who are receiving different rates of pay, as long as the differences in the rates of pay is not based on another prohibited ground, being gender. Okay, so to break down what substantially the same work means, is that the work is somewhat the same, but not necessarily identical. So the work is similar enough that it could reasonably be considered to fall within the same job classification. And again, does not have to be identical in every respect, nor do the jobs have to be interchangeable. But what's key to note here is that what the analysis is looking at is what is actually being performed in terms of the work. So job titles aside, what the considerations are is the actual work being performed, and not what may be listed in a job description, because those, what an employee does on a day-to-day basis may change, especially over a long-term employment. So there are exceptions. So in terms of justifications for differences in rate of pay, an employer may be able to justify those differences by relying on a seniority system, a merit system, a system that measures earning by quantity or quality of production, or any other difference not based on the sex of the employee or the employment status. And so in terms of when we're talking about seniority, we're talking about this takes into account the years or the hours accumulated by a particular employee. And with respect to merit, what I want to highlight is that employers really need to use an objective method of determining merit that is applied equally and fairly. If it isn't, again, that may open up the employer to liability with respect to a violation under these new provisions. Okay, so moving on to our first case scenario. And so I'll read it very quickly. So Anita, Santosh, Luke, and Miriam are all supervisors who work for a nonprofit. And so the key to remember here are their work status, their employment status. So Anita is full-time and works in the Child and Youth Department. Santosh is part-time, works in the Programs Department. And Luke is full-time, as is Miriam. Miriam is part-time, and they both work in the Outreach Department. As supervisors, they have similar job duties, although some of their tasks are unique to the respective departments. Their employer uses pay bands that are connected to a merit system based on their performance. Anita and Luke are in the supervisor pay band. And just to highlight it, Anita and Luke are full-time employees, but Santosh and Miriam are not in the supervisor pay band. And again, to note, they are part-time employees. So the question that we have is, would you think that this is a violation of the equal pay for work of equal value provisions?
So I'm just going to launch a poll, and it should pop up in your screen shortly. And just to remind you that the question was, is there a violation given that Anita and Luke, who are the full-time employees, are supervisor pay band, and Santosh and Miriam, who are part-time workers, are not in the same pay band? And so I'll just share some of the findings. 66% have said yes, 25 no, and the remaining unsure.
Okay, so the answer is yes, it's likely a violation, but, and here's where we have to break things down a little bit. So on the face of it, it certainly does appear to be a violation. But again, the analysis is going to go to the type of work being performed, and again, looking at what is actually done by these respective individuals. And the other part of it is also looking at very closely at the pay bands and the merit systems to see if any of these fall under the exceptions. So yes, the answer is yes, it's likely a violation, but to step back for a second, there's a larger analysis that needs to be put into play. Okay, so moving on to the request for the review of rate of pay. So if employees who are casual, part-time, temporary, or seasonal believe that they're not receiving the same rate of pay as their full-time and permanent colleagues who are doing substantially the same work, they're entitled to request a review of their pay. And this also applies to temporary help agency employees, who are also, allowed to ask their employer to review their rate of pay if they have those same concerns with respect to employees of the agency's client. Okay. So in terms of making those requests, what's key to note is that employers must either adjust the employee's pay rate if they agree that there's a discrepancy between those rates of pay, or if the employer disagrees, and the key here is to provide a written response giving a reason for the decision. Moving on from that, employers may not lower the rate of pay of existing employees performing substantially the same work to comply with the equal pay requirement, or penalize, otherwise known as reprise, against employees who either request a review of their pay rate or who disclose their rate of pay to another employee potentially, in order to determine if the employer is in violation of the equal pay for work of equal value provisions. Okay, so the reprisal provisions are quite important, so that's something that I think we should highlight. Okay, so now moving into the scheduling changes, which are going to come into effect on January 1st of 2019. And so that gives employers a few more months to get adjusted to these incoming changes, which I know can be a little bit confusing. Okay, so the first of these is the 3-hour rule. And so, as it currently stands, if an employee regularly works more than 3 hours per day and is scheduled to work but works less than 3 hours despite being available to work longer, they are entitled to be paid for 3 hours of work. However, as it currently applies, employers are only required to ensure that employees receive either their regular wages for time worked or 3 hours of minimum wage, whichever is greater. So how this changes is that the new 3-hour rule that will come into effect on January 1st of 2019 changes this calculation. So if an employee who regularly works more than 3 hours a day is required to present themselves for work but works less than 3 hours, there's a new calculation. The employer must pay the employer wages for 3 hours in the next calculation, as we're going to show in the next slide. Okay, so my apologies. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the new calculation refers to wages for 3 hours equal to the greater of either the employee's regular rate for 3 hours of work or the sum of the amount the employee earned for the time worked and the employee's regular rate for the remainder of the time. So if the employee is entitled to a form of premium pay, whether it's overtime pay, while working, the employee keeps this entitlement for this 3-hour period. Okay, so in terms of the minimum pay for on-call work, and I understand this is the one that's giving people the most concern. So currently, the Employment Standards Act does not provide for any payment to an employee if that employee is on call to work and is not called in or required to work. This is going to change as of January 1st of 2019. In that if an employee who is on call to work is not required to work or is required to work but works less than 3 hours despite being available to work longer, the employer must pay the employee wages for 3 hours equal to, or to the greater of the following. And again, we're going to that calculation that we used earlier would apply. Again. Okay, so in terms of, let's jump to the case scenario, just to illustrate this. So Johan is employed as an administrative support staff with a local nonprofit. The organization has been exceptionally busy for the past 2 weeks, and he has been scheduled to work 3 hours of overtime on Wednesday evening. He arrived at work on Wednesday, but only worked 2 hours rather than the scheduled 3 hours. So under the new provisions, what is Johan's employer obligated to pay him? Is it A, 3 hours of overtime pay, B, 3 hours of regular pay, C, 2 hours of overtime pay, or D, 2 hours of overtime pay and 1 hour of regular pay?
We're just going to launch that poll again. And just a reminder that Johan has been scheduled to work for 3 hours of overtime, but only work 2. And how does that apply in the new provisions? So we've got almost 50% saying A, 3 hours of overtime pay, 40% saying D, 2 hours of overtime pay and 1 hour, and a few in between.
Okay.
We're just going to close that poll.
Okay, so the answer is D. So he's entitled to not only the 2 hours of overtime pay, because that's what he worked the 2 hours, but he's also entitled to the 1 hour of regular pay. And so that's how the calculation under the new provisions is now going to work. Where again, the employee would be entitled to, the premium pay if they had been scheduled for overtime for the amount of time worked, and if they worked less than the 3 hours, then the balance of that calculation is going to be with respect to their regular rate of pay. Okay, we're going to jump into another case scenario. So Christina is a staff member with a community hub in Mississauga. She's usually scheduled to work on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. So actually what we're going to do, let's jump forward to the shift calculation. Okay, first.
So the next slide, and we'll come back to that.
Yes, we'll come back to that. I'm realizing that I'd rather just do it this way. Okay, so the shift calculation pay. So again, this is also a new change. If the employer cancels the employee's scheduled day of work or on-call period with less than 48 hours of notice prior to the start time, the employer must pay the employee wages equal to 3 hours of pay at the employee's regular rate. And so the exceptions to this is whether the employer was unable to provide work because of fire, lightning, power failure, storms, or similar causes beyond their control. The employee's work is weather dependent, and the employer is unable to provide work for weather-related reasons. And then, we're waiting to see if the Ministry of Labor is going to provide any other reasons under this provision. So keeping this in mind, we're going to go back to scenario 3. Okay, so Christina is a staff member with a community hub in Mississauga. She's usually scheduled to work on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. She was scheduled to work her usual shift on Thursday, arriving at 10 a.m., but ended up working only 1 hour as the center was exceptionally quiet that day. When she received her next pay, when she saw her next pay stub, she realized that she was only paid for 1 hour for that day and raises it with her employer. Her employer maintains that she only worked for 1 hour and should only be paid for 1 hour. So is Christina's employer in violation of the new scheduling provisions?
And so we have 98% who said yes.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. So yes, it is a violation. She was available to work for more than the 3 hours. Just because it was exceptionally quiet that day doesn't mean that she shouldn't be paid for the fact that she was there and able to work for beyond the 1 hour. So yes, everyone got that one absolutely right. Okay, so moving on to case scenario number 4. Okay, so Ray is one of Christina's colleagues. He provides outreach to clients who are homeless, which requires him to be outside on most days. He works similar hours as Christina, as he's usually scheduled for 5-hour shifts 3 days a week. During one of his scheduled shifts, he only ends up working 2 hours rather than his usual 5 hours, as his employer canceled the balance of his shift due to a severe winter storm. Ray's employer only pays him for the 2 hours he worked that day. Is Ray's employer in violation of the scheduling provisions?
Okay, we have about 82% who've said no, and the remainder yes, and a few unsure.
Okay, and again, the answer is it's not a violation. And again, if we go back and we look at the exceptions, where the rule does not apply if the employer was unable to provide work because of fire, lightning, power failure, storms, or similar causes beyond their control, or the employee's work is weather dependent and the employer is unable to provide work for weather-related reasons. So again, in this scenario, Ray works outside for the most part. There's a storm, and so he only works for for the 2 hours that day. So everyone got that absolutely correct. Okay. So we're now going to move on to the maximum entitlement that an employee can receive. So the good news for the employers is that an employee's entitlement with respect to the 3-hour rules and the shift cancellation and whatnot is that the maximum entitlement is limited to 3 hours pay. So even if more than one scheduling cancellation occurs in a single day within a 24-hour period, the employee's maximum entitlement is no more than 3 hours pay calculated appropriately. And remember, as we discussed before, that may include premium pay for whatever the number of hours worked. Okay. So again, beginning in 2019, an employee will have the right to refuse an employer's request or demand to work or be on call on a day that the employee was not scheduled to work or be on call if the request or demand is made less than 96 hours before the time the employee would normally commence work or commence being on call. And so there are exceptions to this again. And it's important to note that employees, if they refuse to attend at their shift, they must notify the employer of their refusal as soon as possible. So in terms of the exceptions, employees cannot refuse a shift if the employer's request is to deal with an emergency, remedy or reduce a threat to public safety, ensure the continued delivery of essential public services, or for any other reasons. Okay. So just to clarify this a little bit, employers are not required to give employees their schedule in advance, but now providing more than 96 hours notice would protect employers from the risk that some employees might refuse to attend at work. And what I wanted to highlight here is how emergency, as the legislation currently outlines it, what that means. And that is a situation that constitutes a danger that could result in serious harm to people or substantial damage to property, and that is caused by the forces of nature, disease, or other health risk, an accident or an active or a situation involving a search and rescue operation. There may be, as this is implemented, other things that are defined as emergency, but as it currently stands, this is where it is.
And if I might add, Natasha, in terms of the emergency definition as well as the exceptions, given that it's still in progress, the Ministry of Labor may also include other definitions that we're not aware of.
Exactly, absolutely, that's correct. So moving on to case scenario number 5. So Hiba and Monica work as recreation coordinators for a nonprofit in Oshawa. They work primarily with elderly clientele, while Hiba generally works Monday to Thursday from 12 to 8 p.m. Monica works the same hours between Friday and Sunday. On Wednesday evening, the employer received a call from Hiba's sister advising that she was very ill and had been admitted to the hospital for treatment. As Hiba could not attend her Thursday shift, the employer called Monica and advised that she had been scheduled to work the Thursday in addition to her usual shifts. So in this scenario, is the employer in violation of the new scheduling provisions?
We'll launch another poll. And just a reminder, the context was that Hiba was very ill, admitted to the hospital, and the employer then called Monica and advised that she would be scheduled to work. So we're a bit on the fence. 42% say yes, 44% say no, and the remaining are unsure.
Okay, so the answer to this is it's not a violation, but okay. So here's how I'll explain that. So under the new scheduling rules, because HIBA hasn't been provided with a 96 hours advance notice of the change to her schedule, she can refuse to work or she can work it. Where the violation would occur is if the employer reprised against her for refusing to work, or the employer insists that she works where she works that, insists that she works that shift. So for employers, the note here is that you should have a backup plan if this happens, because again, under the new legislation, the employee now has the option to refuse the shift without that 96-hour notice. And again, what I also wanted to highlight is by the current definition of emergency, the scenario here in terms of HIBA being ill and admitted to the hospital, it doesn't quite fall under the definition of emergency that's currently outlined by the Ministry of Labor. Okay, so again, the key is not necessarily a violation, but it could be, again, if the employer does, reprises against the employee or forces them to work for that shift. Okay. And just a quick note, because I know we dealt with this in the disclaimer with respect to unionized employees. So just again, with these changes, for unionized employees, collective agreements that are in effect on January 1st of 2019 will prevail. So they're still going to stand where there is a conflict with respect to these scheduling, new scheduling provisions, whether it's the minimum pay for being on call, the shift cancellation, or the right to refuse work. Okay, so I just wanted to make a really quick note about that. Again, we're not addressing unionized employees, but I know that this is going to be a big issue. Okay, so another change is that employees who have been employed for at least 3 months can make a request in writing for a change related to either their schedule or their work location. Again, the key being here, without fear of reprisal. So employers who receive such requests are required to discuss the request with the employee and notify the employee of their decision within a reasonable time. What I want to highlight here is that you should, as an employer, you should provide your decision in writing. And there's currently no guidance on what constitutes a reasonable time. But again, I think it really depends on the context. And so certainly the sooner the better would certainly fall within a reasonable time. But it's important to note that has not yet been determined. Okay, so in terms of responding to these requests for changes, if the employer grants the request, either in part or all of it, they must specify the date that the change will take effect and the duration if applicable. And if the employer denies the request, they must explain why. And again, I have to highlight that denial, or whatever the outcome is, should be outlined in writing. Okay, so we wanted to step back a little bit and speak about the record keeping requirements that are both currently in effect and will be coming into effect by virtue of the new scheduling changes scheduled for January 1st of 2019. So, but starting with the new record keeping requirements for employers that are currently in effect, we just wanted to remind employers that they must keep the following new records, and that's with respect to the dates and time that an employee has worked. If an employee has multiple rates of pay and worked overtime in a given week, the dates and times that the employee performed overtime work and the applicable rate of pay. and the amount of vacation pay that an employee earned and how it was calculated. So that's currently in effect. Looking forward to January 1st of 2019, employers must keep the following new records. And this includes dates and time of any cancellation of a scheduled day of work or scheduled on-call work, dates and times that an employee was scheduled to work or be on call, and any changes to the on-call schedule. And these records, again, to highlight, must be kept for 3 years. Okay. So going into the enforcement of the ESA, and we did cover this last time, but I think it really does bear in terms of, it's quite important that we highlight it again. And so, you know, if an employment standards officer, otherwise known as an ESO, believes that an employer has contravened either the the equal pay for work of equal value provisions, they may determine the amount owing to the employee as a result of the contravention, and that amount will be deemed to be unpaid wages for that employee. Also, if an employment standards officer believes that an employer has contravened a provision in the ESA, they may send out notice of the contravention specifying an amount to be charged as a penalty, and penalties are determined in accordance with the regulations. And if an employer is deemed to have contravened the ESA after being issued a notice of contravention, the ministry may publish or otherwise make available to the general public the name of the organization and describe what the contravention and the penalty were for that particular contravention. So in getting prepared for these changes, 175 more employment standards officers have been hired or in the process of being hired, and they can investigate a workplace in response to an employee complaint, or they can on their own proactively start an investigation. They can visit your workplace without notice, and an employer is required to produce requested records and answer relevant questions. So again, we have to highlight with respect to the new record keeping provisions and the ones that are going to be in place, it's quite important that an employer is on top of that. And again, Bill 148 has increased the flexibility around the monetary orders that can be issued by an employment standards officer, and the Ministry of Labour can also decide to initiate a prosecution in court for an ESA violation. And so what we wanted to move on now to our best practices for employers and boards of directors. And these are things that I think we really want you to keep in mind in terms of the current provisions that are currently in effect and the ones that are going to be coming into effect in the new year. So employers really should ensure that the personnel, whether it's managers, human resources staff, and those who are responsible for scheduling, are aware of the incoming changes. And they should handle scheduling with care and foresight, because ultimately, if that's not done, again, with the new scheduling provisions and the new rates of pay in terms of calculating with respect to either the 3-hour rule or the minimum on-call rules and the whatnot, it could be quite costly. So it's important that employees are provided with ample notice, either it being the 48 hours notice to cancel the work shift or on-call period, or more than the 96 hours notice to request employee attendance at a work shift or on-call period. Again, along the same lines, employers really should carefully consider their staffing needs to avoid the application of the 3-hour rule when sending employees home before they've completed 3 hours of work. And they really should have a backup plan in the event an employee refuses a shift scheduled on short notice. And again, in terms of implementing standardized procedures for how an employee might request a schedule or location state change, and how those requests will be decided and communicated. So again, in the intervening months before the scheduling changes come into effect, it would be really useful to spend this time to put your minds to, as employers, how those requests will be dealt with, again, whether, and how they're going to be implemented.
And if I may add, for boards of directors, since many of the meetings are on a quarterly or much later basis, then with all of the lead up time to January 1st, then it would be great to get these items on the agenda and able to be discussed more thoroughly.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's absolutely key. And so, especially for boards, reviewing current policies in light of the new scheduling provisions, and revising those policies as needed. And again, as Menina mentioned, as we have these intervening months, to use them wisely in terms of taking a good look at those policies, and also to using the time to develop processes to address, again, these requests for shift and location changes. And I think really putting your minds to what factors will be considered in making these decisions. Because again, when there's greater clarity and transparency on the part of the employer, it's always better in terms of how that information is relayed to the employee. And along those same lines, again, important for the employer to consider developing standardized request and response forms with respect to those types of requests.
So thank you, Natasha. I think we went through a lot of information, a lot of new concepts. So for those of you who this may be the first time engaging with the equal pay for work of equal value, or for the scheduling provisions, don't be alarmed if you feel a little overwhelmed and saturated with the info. I just want to remind you that Natasha and I have been working on this for a number of months, so she's able to speak about it very clearly and with ease because of the nature of this work that we've been doing together. But we do have ONN's Bill 148 FAQ page, and this is where all of the information that you've heard today and previous webinars will be updated and available at any time. So if you walk away from this and need a refresher, the handouts are available, the webinar will be available there too. But before I go on in terms of the next steps, I just wanted to thank Natasha for all this helpful information and helping us navigate through this very new and foreign concept of legislation that's coming our way. And as she mentioned, really, if you have specific questions about how these rules apply to your specific organization and your staff, we recommend that you seek legal advice. Thank you to your questions at the Bill 148 email address. We've taken a lot of those questions and content into consideration into developing our webinar series as well as our FAQ page. But in some cases, if you may wonder why we haven't responded to it, it simply is we don't have enough information to be able to inform you with the correct answer. So we really do recommend that you seek some legal advice and legal expert to look into it a little bit more detail. But in terms of final items that might be helpful, like I mentioned, all of the content we cover today and more is available on the FAQ page. We encourage you to visit this page for further information, but also in the near future as we continue to update with today's webinars and the slides available. In the coming weeks, keep out for an online costing tool that we've also been developing to help your nonprofit estimate the financial impact of pieces of Bill 148, as well as a slide deck that we've developed for senior management and boards of directors specifically. What I have to say to Natasha is it's really helpful to highlight those employer best practices, because while a lot of responsibility is on the organization, as nonprofits, we also have our boards of directors to report to. And so being able to translate this information and get it in front of the boards of directors is an important piece, and getting the entire organization understanding the impacts of Bill 148 and also the process on how the organization will deal with it. So you'll get an email about the costing tool as well as the board slide deck and the senior management slide deck in the near future. And you'll also get a follow-up email with all of the webinars and slides in this series early next week. Like I said, lastly, if you are unclear about how the legislation impacts you, we suggest that you seek legal advice, but also consider contacting the Ministry of Labor for further information and clarification. That link will bring you to their Contact Us page to be able to help better navigate and understand the legislation as it comes about. Also, for further information about ONN and all of the work that we do, including Bill 148 and many more other projects, then please visit our website. I want to again thank United Way for supporting ONN in our Bill 148 education webinar series. For those who are new to our webinar series, we've been working on this for the past 3 months, and it's through United Way that we've been able to make this possible. I also want to take a moment to thank our participants for joining us today. We hope that this series has helped you better understand and how to implement Bill 148. And just a friendly reminder that the slide handouts are available on the handout section on your dashboard through GoToWebinar, and they'll be emailed to you at a later date. This webinar is just one of the ways in which ONN supports Ontario's nonprofit sector, bringing the latest information and experts directly to you. If you'd like to know more about ONN membership and our work, please contact us. So thank you again, Natasha. We hope that this has been a helpful webinar to you all, and we hope you have a wonderful long weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.